Wow. That was quite the intro. Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you all for being here tonight. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Can you all hear me just fine?
Mm-hmm.
Great, okay. So I first met Jonathan Lunine actually at another KISS workshop. And since then, he's fueled a passion for discovery and learning more about icy worlds in many students. And at the time, I was a postdoc. And he also fueled that passion for me in my career. So I owe a lot to Jonathan, who is the David C. Duncan Professor in Physical Sciences and the Director of the Center for Radiophysics and Space Research at Cornell.
Now renamed.
Yes, he got his bachelor's in physics and astronomy from the University of Rochester, and then came to Caltech for his master's and his PhD in planetary science. Now, when I first met Jonathan, I tried to figure out, because I hadn't read your bio at the time, what his field of expertise was. And I remember him talking very intelligently about geology, and I thought, oh, he must be a geologist. But then he threw out some chemistry terms too, and I'm like, okay, maybe he's a chemist? Maybe he's a geochemist. But then he would talk about physics and about astronomy, and I realized by then that he was a planetary scientist. He's sort of the Renaissance man of planetary science. And so it's kind of a model that I think we can all look to when we're trying to work in a field where it's a nexus of many different areas of expertise. So Jonathan's research focuses on a lot of things: planetary formation, evolution, habitability. He's particularly interested in icy worlds, which he'll be telling you about tonight. He's the David Baltimore Distinguished Visiting Scientist at JPL. Also, he's an interdisciplinary scientist both for the Cassini mission and for the James Webb Space Telescope. And there's a long list. I'm not going to go through everything. He's a co-investigator on the Juno mission and a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And recently, in 2015, he was awarded the Jean-Dominique Cassini Medal of the European Geosciences Union. So, with that introduction, I am very happy to welcome Jonathan Lunine.
Okay. Well, when you said you were trying to figure out my field of expertise, I was going to help you by saying I have none. So, anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here speaking again at Caltech, and I especially want to thank the Keck Institute for Space Studies, and I want to say that my experience with the Institute and with its director Tom and Associate Director Michelle, or whatever your title is, yes. It's a unique institute. It generates remarkable ideas. It has had, if you don't know it, a profound effect potentially on the direction of the U.S. human spaceflight program through the Asteroid Redirect mission. And it's just a great generator of new ideas. So hopefully 8 years won't be the end of this thing, and that there will be more. And so I hope things actually will continue. It would be great. I also want to say that I recognize that the Republican debates are starting, and also that some people in the room actually have an invitation to meet with Matt Damon and watch The Martian in a special preview. So here are the conclusions of my talk. And if you want to go, you can go, and that'll clear the room out. So we have very strong indicators of habitable environments in 2 outer solar system moons, Europa around Jupiter and Enceladus around Saturn, and I will describe that evidence. At Europa, what we desperately need now is to identify whether there are organic molecules in the salty ocean of Europa and whether they are accessible at the surface and can be studied. We want to confirm the identity of the salts and determine how to actually access this ocean that has been essentially discovered by the Galileo orbiter. So there is a mission currently called the Europa Mission. It will get a better name. And we need to get that as quickly as possible to Europa. At Enceladus, there's definitive evidence not only of a subsurface liquid water ocean, but one that is loaded with organics, salts, minerals, and free energy. And Enceladus has a plume that in fact is in part ocean material that's coming out into space. And Cassini has demonstrated that the plume can be analyzed by flying through it safely measuring the constituents with a mass spectrometer. And we can, in fact, do much better than Cassini with a current version of a space-qualified mass spectrometer. Cassini is very old. And actually look for evidence of biological activity. And that's a goal of the mission that I'm going to describe. So go on, watch the debates, although I'm going to bring Donald Trump into this later in the talk. So, all right. So there really are a small number of good targets to explore in our solar system if we're interested in looking for evidence of extant life that's existing today, or even extinct life. You can argue that there are only 4. There may be some others, but these are the ones where the evidence may be accessible in some way. The first, obviously, and the one that we've been thinking about and exploring the longest is Mars. It is a test, in a way, of the outer edge of the habitable zone, which is this idea that you can predict where planets may have life on the basis of whether liquid water is stable on their surfaces. And in the case of our own solar system, of course, you put the Earth in the middle of the habitable zone, and we don't really know where the inner edge is. It's somewhere outward of Venus, and we don't know where the outer edge is. So we'd like to know that for understanding which exoplanets to focus on with spectroscopy from James Webb and other telescopes in the future. So Mars is a test, although it has a problem, which is size. It's a small body. It's 10 times smaller than the Earth in terms of mass. And for that reason, its evolution has been very different from that of the Earth. And a lot of the essentially change from what we think was a habitable environment early in its history to what is today an uninhabitable environment at the surface may well have to do with its size rather than its position, its orbit around the sun. And also, access to extant life is going to be very difficult. If it's there, it's probably in the crust. We would have to drill down perhaps several kilometers to get to where there might be water that would sustain that life. And a further problem with Mars, and these are not reasons not to explore Mars, but they're cautions, is that if we do stumble upon evidence for life, either fossils or organisms or chemical evidence for life, because Mars is so close to the Earth, there is a demonstrated ability for material to be exchanged by impacts of asteroids or comets on Mars, transporting material to the Earth, or much more rarely, the other way around. So if we find life on Mars, it might turn out to have had the same origin as life on Earth. And of course, the really interesting question, particularly with regard to whether life is common in the universe, is whether life had a second separate origin from life on Earth somewhere in the solar system. So Mars might tell us that if we actually find evidence someday of organisms and can determine whether in fact they're genetically related to life on Earth, but it's going to be difficult. Titan is a very large moon of Saturn with seas of methane and ethane and a very dense atmosphere. It's a fascinating place to go look for forms of life that might be able to survive in liquids other than liquid water. That's one of the topics of the KISS workshop this week. That, of course, would be a very, very strong test of the notion that chemical evolution proceeds a very long way, even in non-aqueous media, to the point where perhaps the information needed to construct cell structures and catalysts and so on actually can occur in liquids other than liquid water. But I'm not going to talk about Titan today. That's an entire talk unto itself. And then Europa and Enceladus, way out of the traditional habitable zone because their liquid water is not on their surfaces. And we think that the mechanism for heating the interiors to produce that liquid water is in fact tides from their parent planets, Jupiter in the case of Europa and Saturn in the case of Enceladus. So they're intriguing objects that only in the last 20 years have we known for Europa, and in the case of Enceladus, the last 10 years, that they might in fact be places that could harbor life. So I'll start with Europa. It's a moon of Jupiter that is the size of our own moon. We can call it a rock ice world. It's really a rocky world. The water component is a very thin layer that you'll see in a diagram on the next slide, really is a small part of Europa. So if you were to strip off all of the ice and the ocean underneath, it wouldn't be much smaller than what you see here and would be about the size of our moon. It has a very tenuous atmosphere. That atmosphere is mostly driven by evaporation from the surface and sputtering. There is a very, very strong radiation field that Europa moves through. Jupiter has a very, very strong magnetic field, and that magnetic field then generates this very large magnetosphere with a very heavy load of charged particles that move very fast, that cause sputtering and also cause problems for spacecraft operations at Europa. The radiation environment is such that spacecraft don't last very long if they linger at the orbit of Europa. And then the Galileo mission, which was an orbiter that orbited Jupiter from 1995 to 2003, Torrance Johnson was the project scientist for that. He's in the audience. That actually provided the evidence for a subsurface water ocean under the ice crust. Now, there had been speculation about such an ocean after the Voyager flybys in 1979, when it was discovered that Io had volcanism, and just before that discovery, Peel, Caston, and Reynolds had come out with a paper showing how tidal heating could in fact heat the interior of Io to the point where rock would actually be melted and cause volcanism. And since Io is closer to Jupiter than Europa is, but not by very much, it was natural to speculate whether Europa might be tidally heated, enough at least to melt the liquid water and produce an ocean. And so there were a number of papers after Voyager speculating on this, but it was really the Galileo mission that provided the evidence for the ocean. And the evidence came in two forms. One was by imaging, and the other was from a magnetometer measuring magnetic fields. So this is an example of the imaging evidence. This is about 70 kilometers across. This is the surface of Europa seen by Galileo. You can actually, in Photoshop, take these various chunks of the crust. By the way, all of this is frozen, but you can take these pieces in Photoshop and you can actually put them back together again. So it's evident that this part of the crust has been broken up. These rafts have been rotated and moved around, and that's strong evidence that there was at least underneath a liquid layer at some time. And the fact that we see no impact craters in this image suggests that that happened very, very recently. The other evidence that is actually more convincing for an ocean comes from the Galileo magnetometer, which measures the magnetic field in the various regions where the orbiter flew as it went through the Jupiter system. And as that orbiter flew past Europa at different angles, it detected changes in the magnetic field, deflections that were consistent with Europa having what's called an induced magnetic field, not generated by a dynamo inside of the moon itself, but generated by the fact that because Jupiter rotates rapidly, its magnetic lines of force were passing through Europa, and Europa then was deflecting that magnetic field in such a way that it must have inside of it a very high electrical conductivity region, a region with a high electrical conductivity. Higher than the electrical conductivity of water ice, higher than the electrical conductivity of pure water, really has to be salt water. And that work was led by Margie Kivelson and the magnetometer team at UCLA, and Dave Stevenson, who's here, was also involved in that analysis. And it was very convincing, and it tells us that underneath all this is a salty ocean. Now, the source of the energy really is the orbit of Europa. It is in an eccentric orbit. Tidal interactions with Jupiter would tend to circularize that orbit. That's a lower energy state, and that energy then that's taken from the orbit goes into heating the body. The orbit would circularize pretty quickly were it not for the fact that Io, Europa, and Ganymede have orbital periods that are simple integer multiples of each other, as you see down here. And so because of that resonance, Europa gets tugged and pulled at the same point in its orbit regularly, and that maintains the eccentricity as far as we can tell over geologic time. And because of that, then Europa has sustained this liquid water ocean. That's not the only heat source. Europa has radioactive decay and the original energy of accretion, but the tidal heating is important in maintaining this ocean. So this is a model of Europa that was put together after the Galileo mission. This is a possible metallic core. Here's the rock. And this blue thing that you see here and the white above it is the thickness of the ice and the ocean underneath it. So it's really a small part of this body. Nonetheless, if you total up the amount of water, which is determined by the distance down to this rocky mantle, it's about 2 Earth oceans worth of water. So it's about twice the amount of water that we have in the Earth's ocean. What we do not know is how thick this outer crust is, and that, of course, is crucial to understanding whether we can actually access the ocean and search for life. The other thing we don't know is what else is in this ocean besides salty water. These fractures that you see at the surface here are discolored, and there was a spectrometer, a near-infrared spectrometer on Galileo. It was badly affected by the radiation, and so the results were noisy. It seems to suggest that there are salts that have been deposited on the surface, but there are other alternative explanations as well. So we really don't understand what besides water might be present in the Europa Ocean. Salt has to be there in order to get the electrical conductivity high enough, but we don't know what kind of salts. And we really have no evidence for whether organics are present either. So we'd like to get down and sample the ocean, but we also don't know how thick the crust is. So if you look at a place like this on Europa, 360 kilometers is the vertical distance here on this image, and you see these cycloidal features here, these fractures. These are best explained as fractures that are formed and open and close as Europa goes closer to Jupiter and then farther away in its orbit. And if that explanation is right, then the crust under the thickness of the crust that these have formed in must be on the order of 100 meters, fairly thin, something that conceivably you could drill through. On the other hand, you go to a different part of Europa and you see something like this. This is an impact crater. It's the crater Powell. It's about 30 kilometers in diameter. And in order for an impact crater like this to be retained on the surface, for the topography to be retained, the crustal thickness in that region has to be a couple of times or several times the diameter of this crater, and so somewhere upwards of 100 kilometers. So evidently the crust of Europa is highly variable in thickness, and we don't really know where the thinnest part of the surface is. Galileo gave us some information, but because of its antenna problems, we don't have complete imaging coverage over the whole surface. So finally, after 16 years of trying, NASA has a mission that will go back to Europa and build on the results of the Galileo flybys. It's currently got the imaginative name Europa Mission. This will hopefully change sometime soon. This is the instrument payload that was selected. I want to call out a few instruments. They're instruments to do in situ compositional measurements of the Europa environment. Here's a mass spectrometer that we'll return to a little bit later because it's on the Enceladus Life Finder mission concept. And this one, the Surface Dust Mass Analyzer, SUDA, SUDA is going to measure actually dust and ice that comes off of the surface and determine the composition. And mass specs will measure the gas that is present in this exosphere. If Europa has a plume, and there is controversial circumstantial evidence that there may be a plume observed by a Hubble Space Telescope, these instruments could potentially measure the composition of that plume if the spacecraft is flown through it. But we don't really know whether those HST data are telling us that there's a plume or not. It could be something else. What I want to focus on for a few minutes is this instrument, the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, or MISE. Diana Blaney at JPL is the principal investigator. I'm a co-investigator on this mission, on this instrument. And this really is the instrument that one needs if we are going to answer the question of whether there are organics in the ocean of Europa. You need organics if you want life, carbon-bearing molecules. And whether those organics have come out onto the surface and whether they come out in a way that's frequent enough that there's fresh material that we can analyze before it is transformed by the radiation environment. So this instrument is a near-infrared mapping spectrometer. And its goals are to assess the habitability of Europa's ocean by understanding compounds on the surface that may have come out through the cracks from the ocean, and to investigate the geologic history. And so we will look for organics, we'll look for salts, we'll look for evidence of hot spots, and we'll also, by looking at changes in spectral features associated with water ice, be able to date different parts of the Europa surface as they're transformed by radiation. So just to give you one example of the diagnostic power of a near-infrared spectrometer, these are spectra. So this is basically the light that you get off the surface as sunlight hits Europa and then bounces back off to the spectrometer. That light is spread out in wavelength by the spectrometer, and these dips and rises as a function of wavelength are diagnostic of the particular materials that are on the surface that have reflected the light from the sun. So this spectrum is split from 1 to 2.5 microns, and the part of the spectrum where we can see is down here in the visible, so this is near infrared, and then 2.5 to 5 microns. These are laboratory spectra of different components, and you see that in the shorter wavelength region, water ice and salts dominate the spectrum. In the longer wavelength region, organics like benzene and octane dominate the spectrum. So by having a sensitive spectrometer that goes out from 1 all the way to 5 microns, and by being able to look at specific places and essentially take images, but each pixel of that image is a spectrum, so in a way it's an image cube, we can look for organic molecules and look for salts and identify their nature. So we'll look on global scales, on regional scales, and also on local scales as small as 25 meters per pixel, which is what's really needed to plan an eventual lander mission, or possibly this mission itself may carry a small lander, we don't know. But certainly for future missions, to be able to look in regions where there are fresh cracks, where ocean water may be welling up, and see whether organics are present there. So my personal hope is this mission will get going before I retire. In 1999, I was the principal investigator for a spectrometer and imager for a Europa mission. That mission was canceled by NASA before the instruments were selected, but not before we all had to write our proposals and send them in. So, you know, the fastest this could get there, if we have a launch on a large rocket, would be 2025. 10 years from now, and if we launch on a smaller rocket, the late 2020s. So Europa has been a long time in coming when you consider the fact that Galileo discovered the ocean, the data from the Galileo orbiter revealed the presence of the ocean in the late 1990s. This is an awfully long time to wait to go back and follow up. So that's as much as I'm going to say for now about Europa. Let me move on to the Saturn system and talk about a very tiny moon that is surprisingly active, and that's Saturn's moon Enceladus. Here's a picture of the Earth, our own moon to scale, and this is the size of Europa, remember, and this is tiny Enceladus. Enceladus is about 500 times smaller in volume than Europa, or the Earth's moon. And as we normally associate smaller bodies with cooling more quickly and being less active, you would be reasonable in assuming that this was just basically a dead chunk of rock and ice in space, but nothing could be further from the truth. Enceladus orbits pretty close to Saturn. Here's Saturn, here are the rings to scale. Here are some of the smaller moons that orbit close to and in the rings. They're intermediate-sized satellites beginning with Mimas here that are hundreds of kilometers in diameter. Enceladus is one of them. It's about 500 kilometers in diameter. The largest of these, Rhea, is out at, I forget, 1,000, 2,000 kilometers in diameter and change, roughly. I'm looking at the Cassini project scientist here, Linda Spilker. And Titan, my favorite object on this scale, would be way outside in the hallway. So the Saturn satellite system extends way out here on this scale. But Enceladus is in a slightly non-circular eccentric orbit, and that eccentricity may in fact be maintained by interactions with other moons, possibly Dione, although it's not as clear-cut a case as for Europa and Ganymede. So Enceladus gets some amount of tidal heating. And by the way, I didn't tell you how much tidal heating Europa gets. It's about 1 terawatt of power. we're going to see some very interesting activity on a moon that gets about 2 gigawatts of power out of this tidal heating. We know something about Enceladus from Voyager. It took pictures, showed that there were parts of the surface that were very smooth. There's actually an effort to look for plumes on Europa, on Enceladus with Voyager data, but none were found. And the Cassini-Huygens mission, which was a follow-on to Voyager at Saturn in much the way that Galileo was a follow-on to Voyager at Jupiter, was the mission that discovered the plume of Enceladus. So this is the Cassini spacecraft. This large saucer-shaped thing that's attached to it is the Huygens probe, which was built by the European Space Agency, flew into the atmosphere of Titan and landed on the surface of Titan in 2005. The rest of this spacecraft, which was built by JPL for NASA, with some contribution from the Italian Space Agency on the antenna, has been spending 11 years now in orbit around Saturn, using Titan as a slingshot and visiting various other moons and the rings, and really an amazing voyage of discovery. It's a big spacecraft. These are full-size human beings down here. And the dry mass is 2,500 kilograms, but fully fueled, most of this is fuel to get into orbit around Saturn. Fully fueled, it was 6,300 kilograms. So really a massive spacecraft with over a dozen instruments on the orbiter, all joint between the US and Europe, and then 6 instruments on the probe. I'm only going to talk about the orbiter data. Things happened pretty quickly. Cassini went into orbit in 2004 after a 7-year journey, and very soon after it went into orbit, the magnetometer, during a moderately close flyby of Enceladus, detected a perturbation in the Saturn magnetic field that suggested that there was neutral material coming out of the south polar region of Enceladus. And shortly after that, the imaging system, looking at Enceladus backlit by the sun is on the opposite side of the spacecraft here, so this is a high phase angle image, saw this, and when you stretch that image, there is definitely material coming out. And it's coming out of the south polar region. Here you see the South Pole about in here, sorry. This region is actually set apart from the rest of Enceladus by a kind of a fault system. And there are these stripes, originally called tiger stripes, that are fractures. And it's out of these and some subsidiary fractures that this material, which is both gas and solid, is pouring out of Enceladus. And in later images taken by the imaging system on Cassini, you can see that the plume resolves into individual jets. There may be upwards of 100 jets, and that material then merges together to make this plume. That material goes out and orbits Saturn. It immediately was the solution to the problem of where Saturn's E-ring came from. The E-ring is a tenuous ring that is co-located with the orbit of Enceladus around Saturn. And we've known of the E-ring for about 5 decades, so that gives us a lower limit to the persistence of this plume. And so this was a remarkable discovery, but even more remarkable is that Cassini could be flown through this plume, and because it carries with it 2 mass spectrometers, the composition of the plume could be analyzed in situ, and then the remote sensing instruments in the ultraviolet and in the visible and the infrared could supplement that with observations at a distance. So the geology of Enceladus is really remarkable. It's heavily fractured and folded and twisted. This is the south polar region. The north polar region is heavily cratered, so all this activity is occurring really in a restricted part of this moon. And it's a very complex surface, but out of many of these fractures, gas and ice are pouring out. So with Europa, we don't know whether there are organics in the interior. In the case of Enceladus, we knew that very early on from the mass spectrometer, but what we didn't know was whether the source region of these jets was liquid water or not. One theory was that it might be warm ice, clathrate hydrate, which was releasing this material, and I'll get back to that in a minute. The mass spectrometer, which is a device that essentially measures the mass over charge of molecules and atoms, is a general and very powerful chemical tool for determining composition. Here is sort of a reconstructed cartoon version of a mass spectrum from the INMS instrument on Cassini. This is number of counts versus mass in what's called Daltons here, but is now referred to as U, or atomic mass units. This is all to confuse me. It's a chemist's basically invention. But anyway, this is basically the mass, the number of protons and neutrons. And it's actually mass over charge. But typically, the particles or the molecules and atoms are only singly charged, so the mass over charge is really the mass. So anyway, what you see here are fragments and whole molecules of water in blue, of methane and ammonia in green, of organics containing 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons, and this is benzene, C6H6, probably, and the noble gas argon. So we know there are organics in the plume. This is incontrovertible evidence. However, this particular mass spectrometer, which is vintage 25 years ago, doesn't have really good mass resolution. So there's a whole suite of different molecules that actually might correspond to each of the mass ranges, and we can't resolve those. And I'll get back to how we'll do that a little bit later. There's a second mass spectrometer on Cassini called the Cosmic Dust Analyzer, and it actually specializes in analyzing solids. It has a collision plate in the inlet that breaks apart the ice particles and then analyzes the fragments, the gas that comes off. So the Cassini CDA found sodium and potassium in the plume material. And in fact, it was able to find the other half of the salts in each case, sodium chloride. So there is salt in this plume, in the ice itself. And in fact, the sodium and potassium concentrations increase with the particle size. So the largest ice grains have upwards of a few percent salt, which is what we have in our own oceans. And this was very, very strong evidence that the largest ice grains, in fact, were frozen seawater. Meanwhile, the thermal infrared device on Cassini measured temperatures along these cracks. This yellow is highest temperature, blue is lowest. This corresponded to about 190 Kelvin. That's at the top of the cracks, so the temperatures are going to be higher, deeper down. That was indirect evidence that the source region for this plume was, in fact, liquid water and not warm ice. But the smoking gun for all this came from 2 experiments on Cassini. One, the radio science that measures the mass distribution inside Enceladus, coupled with measurements of the topography on Enceladus, work done by a group led by Luciano Yes and involving Dave Stevenson and myself. Those data indicated that underneath the South Polar region, there was an ocean about 30 or 40 kilometers below the surface of the ice, a region that was slightly denser and really very strongly would have to be liquid water and nothing else. But very recently, in fact, just published, there's a news story about this in the last couple of days, another group involved with Cassini, looking at the imaging data, were able to measure a libration, or a rocking back and forth of Enceladus. And the amplitude of that libration actually requires that the ice crust of Enceladus be decoupled from the interior, from the rocky core. And in fact, even though Enceladus is small, it's got a high density, about 1.6 grams per cubic centimeter. Liquid water is 1. So we know that Enceladus actually is mostly rock with this rather thick veneer of water ice around it. And so this ocean must be sandwiched between the ice on top and the rocky core beneath, which is a substantial part of this body. So the gravity and the topography experiment on Cassini and the rotational measurements made by Cassini, completely different types of measurements, both are consistent with an ocean, and in particular the rotational data require that the crust be decoupled from the core so that the ocean is in fact global and not just concentrated at the South Pole. And so this really is very strong evidence that there is a liquid water ocean under the surface, and that in fact we are sampling it by measuring the plume material with Cassini. And another very recent paper this year by the Cosmic Dust Analyzer group reported the detection of silica particles that are very, very small, about nanometers in size, with a very small size distribution. And those particles are present in and around Enceladus, in the Saturn system. The best explanation for those silica particles are that they're actually coming from a region where the liquid water is circulating through the rock, so that silica is dissolving into the hot water. And then as that water comes back out into the ocean and cools, the silica supersaturates, and you get a population of very small, nearly the same size grains. They get blown out through the fractures. They get blown out quickly enough that they have no time to agglomerate and grow to a larger particle size. And that's evidence that, first of all, there is a hydrothermal system, a hot water cycling system down in here, and it's evidence that what is in the plume really is coming from an ocean and not from the crust. All right, so multiple factors make plausible the idea that we should at least search for life. There's a salty ocean, accessible, with energy, with hydrothermal system, possibly at the ocean base, and with organics. All of this measured by Cassini in the plume. No need to land or drill or melt or do anything like that. These literally are free samples. Enceladus is pouring its guts out into space, and Cassini has been measuring this with its remote sensing and in situ instruments. And the last of these wonderful flybys that Cassini will do is in October. It will go the deepest it has into the plume, about 50 kilometers for closest approach, almost to the point where the individual jets are. And one of the things that the INMS will look for is hydrogen, which will tell us a lot about the oxidation state of that ocean. But we're not going to learn much more. The mass spectrometers are 20, 25 years old in technology. They've got low mass resolution. They don't have a great sensitivity. Their mass range is limited to 100 AMU, which is small molecules. If we want to search for life and we want to really characterize the habitability of this ocean environment, which we know exists and we know is pouring out into space, we have to go back. And that's the purpose of the Enceladus Life Finder. We've tried to be very subtle with our cover art here. This is a JPL discovery proposal, which was submitted this year. We're waiting to hear the answer. We think the decision has already been made. But we won't know until late September. And actually, we've been told that because of the Pope's visit to Washington and the closing of federal offices, it may actually be October. So there's a chance to lobby the Pope, and I think he would like this mission quite a lot. So what are we going to do? We will do what Cassini did. We'll send a spacecraft, we'll orbit Saturn, and we'll fly that spacecraft repeatedly through the plume of Enceladus. But we'll do it with the instruments of today, not the instruments of 25 years ago. Much higher sensitivity on the mass spectrometers, much greater mass range out to 1,000 AMU, much higher mass resolution. Instead of being able to determine whether something is 28 or 29 AMU, we'll be able to determine to a level of 30,000 times higher mass resolution the mass of these species. So we'll be able to detect different isotopes, neutrons and protons, and so on. Two differences from Cassini. One is this is all this spacecraft is going to do. Discovery is a cost-limited program, less than $480 million. So this is what it's going to do. And the other is we're going to be the first solar-powered spacecraft around Saturn. And if you're interested in that, ask me later about solar power. We understand this environment that we're going to put this spacecraft through very, very well. Thanks to the Cassini mission, we can plot out the gas density, which you see here, and the grain density of this plume, and it's been observed by Cassini at different orbital phases. We know that it varies from the farthest point of Enceladus from Saturn to the closest point by a factor of 2, but other than that, it's pretty stable. And so this is a map of the gas density expressed as 10 to the 20 water molecules per square meter. Here are 2 ELF flybys through this region, and we'll get gas densities about here. And to detect amino acids and all the species that we want to detect to determine the properties of the ocean, we only need this gas density here. So we're in good shape. There are three objectives. Determine where the material that Enceladus was built out of actually came from. Determine whether the Enceladus ocean in fact is habitable and how habitable is it, and then to determine if in fact there's biological activity. So these are actually the three objectives. These are decadal survey goals. These are our three science objectives: evolution, origin and evolution of Enceladus, habitability of the ocean, and is there evidence of biological activity. I'm not supposed to show you this. This is a JPL Secret, but this is the orbit that's been designed, and I'm not going to go through all the parts of it, but even though we're only doing Enceladus, every orbit is busy. We fly by Enceladus, we collect material, we transmit the data back from the two mass spectrometers, one optimized for gas, one optimized for dust. One of those instruments has a cryotrap, which will concentrate molecules. That cryotrap will then be warmed up later in the orbit, and we'll return the data from that here. And then we'll spend the rest of this orbit figuring out what we found and potentially tuning the mass spectrometers to different mass ranges to optimize the following orbits based on what we learn. The two instruments, I'm not going to go through them in detail. This is the gas mass spectrometer from Southwest Research. It has a very high mass resolution. Here's the mass resolution of the Cassini INMS. You see mass 28 here, and that's all you see. Here's mass 28 resolved, not to the ultimate level that mass specs can do, but to a third of that level. The other instrument is called ENISA, provided by the University of Stuttgart. It's a descendant of the CDA. It will break up the ice particles and do the mass spectrometry on the ice particles. And they're both time-of-flight mass spectrometers, if you're an expert in that. So we're going to measure a lot of species to obtain ocean properties, and I just want to put this up here to impress you, and we can drink and discuss all of these species unless you're under the age of 21, then we'll just discuss them after the talk. But we've identified the species that we want to measure temperature using standard temperature indicators in geochemistry, the redox state, the amount of free energy that's available in the ocean, the oxidation state, how far we are from being extremely reduced or extremely oxidized, and the pH of the ocean. Now, Chris Glein in our team has already used Cassini data with a subset of these, because we have carbon dioxide and we have chlorine and sodium, to get a rough estimate of the pH. And the silica particles give us a rough temperature. And it turns out that in the hot water region, the pH is something like somewhere between 9 and 12. So very much like the Lost City hydrothermal system on the Earth. But the rest we don't know. And we want to look to see if there's evidence of biological processes going on. We're not going to look for organisms and take them apart. We'll look for the chemical clues that life is determining the chemical composition of the non-ice material in the grains. And the tests that we're going to make are designed as much as possible to minimize the ambiguity involved in life detection. So we're not going to carry bread and feed it to organisms, all right? We're going to analyze molecules. The three tests are distinct from each other. Two are pattern tests, and one is isotopic. These tests seek the inherent properties of life, that the relative concentrations of molecules in a particular chemical class are not dictated by reaction kinetics or thermodynamics, but by the needs of a cell, okay? Cells that rely on liquid water. We will look for uneven distribution patterns of structurally related compounds, in particular fatty acids and isoprenoids, for example, in carbon number, because the molecules that make the membranes of our cells don't use any different number of carbons. They actually use either only even carbon numbers, if you're a eukaryote like me or a bacterium, or they use carbon numbers that are built in fives, 5, 10, 15, 20, if you're archaea. And we've tried to make the tests as universal as possible. So what I mean by that is that amino acids are abundant everywhere. They're abundant in meteorites. They're probably abundant in comets. We see them, of course, on the Earth. They're built in space by abiotic processes. And when we look at the amino acid distribution in meteorites, we see that The most abundant amino acids, this is concentration, are the simplest ones, the ones that form most quickly and with the smallest energy requirement, and that's glycine and alanine. But when we look at biological samples from the Atacama or Antarctica, so these are primitive organisms, glycine and alanine are not the dominant ones. Other amino acids are. And this difference, this pattern difference, is also replicated if you synthesize amino acids by abiotic organic chemistry in the lab. Amino acids are abundant. We think they'll be in Enceladus if there's life or even if there isn't life. And the pattern difference between a biological system and an abiotic system is going to be quite evident because this dominance is not what you would see in cells. So for fatty acids, as I said, in bacteria, for example, if you look at the fatty acids and you count the number of carbons in their hydrocarbon tails, you find that they're strongly biased toward even numbers. And that's because the cells build these fatty acids 2 carbons at a time. If you look at archaea, it's every 5 times. If you look at meteorites, you don't get these fatty acids, but you get their carboxylic precursors, and you get every carbon number. And these are different classes in here, so just ignore those. If you make alkanes, which are related to these fatty acids, if you make them in the lab, again, you just get a Poisson distribution of every carbon number. So the difference between biology and abiotic processes is very distinct. And then a completely different kind of test is to measure the isotopic ratios of carbon in the molecules that we sample, carbon-12 to carbon-13. Life tends to favor the use of carbon-12 rather than carbon-13, but there are abiotic processes that mimic that as well. So we actually have a sort of a stair-step series of measurements where we measure the methane to higher hydrocarbon ratio, then we look at the isotopes, then we look at the hydrogen to methane ratio, and all of these have to be in a certain range for us to conclude that biology is at work rather than abiotic processes. So those experiments will be used to essentially put together kind of a table. I'm not going to go through this because of lack of time, but if you get all positive results, you're in the green part of the cube here. This is Tom Spilker's brilliant idea. He's in the audience here and on our team. If you get no results, you're null results on all of them, you get a 0, okay? We would like not to be in the ambiguity area here, but if life is going on, we'll detect the patterns that will put us in the green box here. We have one more life detection experiment, and that is a technology demonstrator. It's not part of our science package because it is experimental in a technological sense. NASA's allowing missions to carry that. Our technology demonstrator will measure by capillary electrophoresis amino acids and determine their handedness, their chirality. Life on Earth is very strongly chiral. It has all left-handed amino acids and all right-handed sugars with very small exceptions. So if we find a strong, what's called an enantiomeric excess in one or the other in amino acids, for example, that's an indicator of life. So why are we doing this with Discovery? Why not wait for a giant flagship mission? And the simple answer is that I would clearly be dead by then, and so will many of you. You know, it's 10 or 20 years between flagship missions, and the next flagship mission of the outer solar system is going to be to the Uranus system, and then to the Neptune system. So if we want to follow up on Cassini's discoveries, we've got to do it with a well-focused, low-cost mission. And that's what Discovery is all about. We're going to follow up on Cassini's discovery with the Discovery-class mission to focus on Enceladus. We would not do costly or high-risk missions like trying to collect a sample from Enceladus and bring it back to Earth until we know its biological potential. That would be a waste. And so doing a low-cost mission allows us to assess whether this really is an object where we ultimately might want to collect samples and actually culture bugs and so on. And finally, actually, the cost is so low that Donald Trump could write a check for this mission. Okay? This would decrease his net worth by much less than 5%, apparently. So, you know, he could write a check. Bloomberg could write a check. Cornell could write a check out of its endowment, and they'd hardly notice it. But anyway, we have to go to NASA to do this. So here's the team. This is only part of the team. Hunter Waite is the deputy PI and providing the mass specs. Frank Postberg over here is providing the Anija experiment along with Ralph Srama. And where did Ralph go? He's over here. Our project scientist, Linda Spilker. Our deputy project scientist is Morgan Cable. We've got experts in organic analysis over here. We've got mission design experts. We've got the world's best spokesperson for Enceladus here. That's Carolyn Porco. Chris McKay, the famous astrobiologist, and actually lots more people. So, you've heard this part before, right? And I think I've made my point. I just want to thank the ELF Science and Instrument team for a fantastic proposal. The scientists and the instrumentalists carried the day on this. And I want to thank JPL, the management and the engineers, for first of all believing in this mission. All right, Brent Sherwood's in the audience. He had to say, yeah, we want to do this, and we started really late. And the engineers at JPL are the best in the world for designing spacecraft. And then for Europa, I want to thank Diana Blaney for actually inviting me on her team. I couldn't believe it, but she thinks I know spectroscopy. And the whole MISE team on the Europa mission is great. And then I have to recognize the Cassini-Huygens project, because without the extraordinary engineering and scientific expertise, we wouldn't know anything about Enceladus today. We'd know nothing about what's going on there. And now we have demonstrably the first habitable, accessible ocean that we can actually go explore and look for life. So let's go do it. Thank you.